The Callisto Protocol. This had been a game that I was most interested in, with the creator of Dead Space being the one to lead Striking Distance Studios into the future, and into building this new tale in a very disturbing light. Once I had booted up the game, I was very excited to begin playing through this new story. But as the deeper I dug into the moon of Callisto, I began to see a very terrible truth. Something I wished I had just skipped on my way back to the Ishimura. But now I feel burdened with such burning knowledge of knowing that there is a survival horror title worse than Dead Space 3, if you can call this game a survival horror title. In this video, we'll be going through all of the Callisto Protocol's good aspects and the very many terrible things that had been delivered to us in order to answer the question that has created a wedge inside of the community. Is this game a fair spiritual successor, or is it not worthy of our time? Well, this is what we will be finding out today. The story is, well, it's not great. Like its predecessor, it does contain the same lackluster writing as the original Dead Space did. However, I feel Dead Space did this a lot better than the Callisto Protocol, as I still feel that Dead Space feels more exciting to be getting through and progressing through than Callisto Protocol, with the game opting to be more cryptic, which is something that Glen has spoken about on how to create horror, that you must hold off on certain information to keep the scares there. But holding back on the characters' information like their stories and their individual histories is a bit of a double-edged blade. If you hold back completely, then why should we feel for their inner turmoil as they desperately try to escape the outbreak on the moon of Callisto? How would the player be able to empathize and relate to these characters? See, this is something that Dead Space has in common with this game. The game had little to no background information on the main characters, especially in the dialogue, which I felt held it back, opting to focus more on scaring and disturbing the player rather than writing a competent story with fleshed out characters. In Dead Space, you only get some information on Isaac, Hammond, and Kendra once you have beaten the game. Can the same be said here? Unfortunately, no. Seeming as the game has no New Game Plus, the logs or core audio files you will find around the game, or around the maps essentially, you will only find bits and pieces of information. Some will talk about the main characters as they have been incarcerated, however most will talk about the outbreak as it progresses. However, in Dead Space you had the characters that would leave behind audio logs that show their turmoil, their struggles, that helped to relate them to the player, to make the player feel more grounded within the world around them, feeling more connected to the world around them. In the Callisto Protocol, there is little to no logs that provide that feeling. Only snippets of dialogue that don't directly affect the player. Sure enough, the quotes can leave us feeling sorry for these characters, but they don't really impact us that much, and that falls down to the poor writing of this game. Unlike Dead Space and other survival horrors, this game provides no text logs, only giving you audio logs to listen to, with a few bits and pieces of text being located in the person's file, which gels with that prison vibe, but again only adds to a lackluster story. The text only really serves to give you some context to the audio logs, much like Isaac's journal in Dead Space. However, the story shares the predictability of its plots with Dead Space, but again I'm not going to spoil it. But it's one of the biggest what the fuck moments I have come across in gaming history. Not because of shock value, but because of how stupid the writing is throughout the game. The writing looks like a fan fiction of Dead Space created by the quote-unquote true fans of Glen Schofield, rather than some talented writers. However, Glen has spoken about the Callisto Protocol in separate interviews all over the platform and on others. One quote I find particularly interesting is that when designing the game and its story, the team had chosen to steer clear of Dead Space from its designs and story beats. However, that couldn't be further from the truth. For this part of the review, I will give the writing team a solid 2 out of 10 for effort, but in execution the story falls flat on its face, if there even is a story to begin with. But fear not, as I've already spoken about Dead Space, having some poor writing in its story, but the combat more than made up for it. Can the same be said for the Callisto Protocol? Let's find out. On paper, the Callisto Protocol's combat sounds really fun and interesting to engage in. However, sadly in execution, once again, the mechanics really let the audience down. In the game, you have 3 different ways of combating the biophages that you encounter, one being melee, another being the grip device, and another being the ranged attacks that you can deal out with 5 different weapons, with the variety of weapons not being so different as Dead Spaces or other survival horrors, with them consisting of 2 pistols, one being the Magnum tactical pistol and another being called the hand cannon. Then you have 2 shotguns, one being the skunk gun, which is your traditional double-barreled shotgun, and another being the riot gun, looking more like a modernized shotgun. The last is the assault rifle that has a burst fire rather than a full automatic fire. In the game, you'll find certain schematics in certain areas that reward exploration, which is great. However, these weapons are scattered so far apart that you'll find the assault rifle, the last weapon, 2 chapters away from the end of the game, which isn't too bad, but I would have preferred that the game had allowed for you to find these weapons sooner rather than later. The melee in this game is one that you will find yourself leaning heavily towards, rather than just strictly shooting your enemies into an assortment of body parts. The way the melee combat works makes me judge what the developers had intended to make, a survival horror or a turn-based action RPG. In this scenario, the enemy will swing their attacks left to right and you'll have to dodge their attacks by moving left or right. However, for the lesser enemies, you can just hold the left arrow key or the thumbstick to either direction with little to no variation, and mostly you will be able to dodge in time. However, sometimes the enemies will actually be able to hit you even though you dodged, or when you have made the correct input to dodge. What do I mean by this? Well, it's fairly simple. The dodge mechanic relies on your input of the movement controls, so sometimes you can get hit even if you move in a certain direction, which costs you a considerable amount of health, as these enemies can kill you in 5 to 6 hits on medium difficulty. As of making this review, I haven't played on the harder difficulty or the easier one, so I don't know how much better or worse these hits can be. The combat is also messy in other areas. For example, you could be locked onto an enemy with you trading blows back and forth, where out of nowhere the other enemies will dogpile you until you die, much like how you get dogpiled in Dead Space 2's multiplayer. Now this is where it separates from other games. The way Jacob moves is considerably slower than how other protagonists in other horror games move. The camera will automatically lock you onto an enemy, allowing for another to grab you or to sneak up behind you when you are low on health. The camera will also shift its focus onto other enemies only when they begin attacking you or when they grab you. While attacking an enemy with a combo, a reticle will eventually pop up before the enemy begins its combo, which can be exploited to continue your combo, which I actually think would have been a good thing if the biophages hadn't been trained by the creed of assassins. The healing factor in this game is another addition that makes you wonder why they even bothered to add this in. With most survival horror games, healing had always been either a quick animation or no animation at all, so that players could quickly heal while in fights or engagements. However, in the Callisto Protocol, if you are low on health, you can't just heal in a fight, as if you attempt to heal, you are placed in a significant disadvantage, with the animation leaving you open for an attack in a 6-second window, allowing for enemies to attack and kill you before you even get the health back, as attacks will interrupt the healing process. So when you are in a fight, you are forced to never use a health injector, as it will always result in you dying. However, sometimes you can find some healing items in rooms that allow you to gain instant health back, so that begs the question, why didn't they just do what the Evil Within did? Quicker healing animations that provides a small boost to your health, and other healing items that restore your entire health bar, but provides some unexpected side effects. The GRP, or the grip device, is one of those things that had been on my mind throughout the course of the development cycle in relation to the combat, and I'm afraid it's a bit of a hit and miss for me. As yes, you can pick up enemies and throw them into nearby environmental hazards such as spiked walls, big industrial fan blades, grinders, and the list goes on. However, the amount of times you can use this ability varies on how much juice is left in the tank, with the meter being located just slightly above the health bar. But due to the size, you can sometimes even forget it's even there, which can be frustrating at times, as if you only have one charge left, you will pick up an enemy and it will be brought over to you, but the charge will expire before you can throw them. So in a nutshell, you are actually helping the biophages out, which can result in a quick death if you say, pick up an exploder. I can see that this was to be intended by the developers. Leaning too heavily on this mechanic can be a bit overpowering, especially if you have a lot of batteries in your inventory. But with the meter being the tiniest line of color on the back of your character's neck, it can be at times overlooked or even forgotten about. And the same can be seen with the health management, with players reporting that they often forgot about the health bar, as unlike Dead Space, the health bar is tiny compared to the rig system. Perhaps by adding in another interface into the gameplay, this could have been avoided. For example, maybe the grip arm could have been used to bring up another menu showing your HUD in greater detail for ease of access. Or maybe when you aim, you can see the meter next to your weapon. Speaking of weapons, the way you swap weapons is a system that doesn't really need to be there, with you only being allowed to hold one sidearm and a primary at a certain time. If you wish to swap these weapons on the console, you will have to push the left D-pad and then scroll down to the desired weapon, and then press the A button to confirm your selection, which doesn't sound too bad unless you are again in a fight, which can be interrupted if you get hit or if you dodge an attack, with the animation of Jacob swapping the weapons being considerably slow, so slow that when I was in the twin-headed behemoth battle, most of my deaths were due to either being not able to swap my weapons fast enough or attempting to run away while swapping weapons, which can get you killed that much faster, and again by the dodge mechanic failing to work, as sometimes I had begun to dodge but the game flat out ignored my input. The store or bench had been taken from Dead Space and had been combined into one utility. However, due to the scarcity of resources found throughout the game, good luck in upgrading all of the weapons and utilities, as those upgrades are very, and I mean very, expensive. However, there is a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel for this plight. Throughout the game, you will be treated to certain items that exist to only be sold, just like the semiconductors in Dead Space. However, each one of these doesn't come with the hinted worth of them. For example, in Dead Space, the diamond semiconductor was worth 25,000 credits, while the bronze semiconductor was worth a measly 1,000 credits. Speaking of credits, the currency in this game sounds like something that I would be able to redeem at a theme park. Callisto credits. Once you find a suit halfway through the game, your inventory size goes up, but it's a far cry from the inventory sizes in Dead Space. When I was playing through the game, I often had thought that the game would introduce a way to upgrade my health or my speed or maybe even my armor on my suit, like Dead Space did, but sadly, there was none of that. The bosses in this game once again aren't plentiful like in Dead Space. We only saw 3 bosses, not including the hunter or brute encounters. In the Callisto Protocol we see 2, not including all of the different sightings or encounters you have with the twin-headed behemoth. And yes, I did make that name up. However, the twin-headed behemoth has got nothing on the final boss, which has been described as horrific, not due to the design, but due to what actually happens in the fight itself. You'll begin the fight going up against Ferris that has evolved into Alpha Ferris. However, the fight again is just dodge, attack, dodge, attack, dodge, attack, dodge, attack. However, remember when I said that the dodge mechanic doesn't matter which way you move the stick? Well, here is a different story for you, as you need to dodge in accordance to which of Ferris's attacks are coming from, which not knowing this actually resulted in a lot of deaths. However, once you defeat him, the next phase will begin, which thankfully gave me a checkpoint for this phase. The phase begins after Ferris mutates into something I can only describe as, well, if YouTube won't demonetize this video for this, Glen's ego. The heavily mutated Ferris will then be given an instant kill melee attack, and a ranged attack that is like a shotgun of spit possessing a wide spread, which can be very hard to dodge while in the open. After dealing enough damage to his face, after you have torn through his flesh shield, which yeah, it does sound a bit dirty, he will call in 4 to 5 exploders that will come after you, which you can use to throw back at him, or you can kill them with the grip or a weapon of your choosing. Personally, I found it much easier just to shoot them, picking up the ammo they leave behind, and then get back to dealing with the devil. On top of the exploders, Ferris will continue to harass you, and remember, if he catches you, it's game over. Along with the exploders, if they get too close to you, they will instantly kill you in a death animation, the same way as the boss. The combat and the balance of these bosses in this game sounded really great until you put them into practice, as the combat itself is poorly implemented into the game, and the other systems in the game make me think that Glen wanted to create Dark Souls in space, as they should have just called the difficulty as cheap, as that's what it felt like. So for all of this segment, I will award the combat a rating 3 out of 10. Giving points for creativity and effort, but negative points for execution. Moving on to the horror elements in this game, I think that the developers may have misunderstood what horror means. Bear with me here. The developers, in their pursuit of creating a spiritual successor to Dead Space, will provide you with themes that are similar to the predecessor. The audio from time to time will be a bit buggy. For example, when Jacob is about to encounter the red room filled with the bodies of the guards, just before he is about to pull the door open, the music gives a sharp tone before you have actually seen what is on the other side. Normally, films and games will hit you with this sharp tone just as you have initially seen what's on the other side of the door. And this is normally used in combination with jump scares these days. And let me tell you, the Callisto protocol uses a lot of jump scare material, and most of them don't even come in different variations. Oh, of course, there will be enemies hiding in lockers or ones that will be hiding in chests, but after the effect wears off, the scare becomes boring, and for me personally, it never got me scared at least once. It just made me feel annoyed as it felt cheap, like the developers had ran out of ideas on how to scare the players, and that Dead Space had just been a fluke. Some of them are almost too predictable in their nature, as we've all seen this before in other video games, and the game is littered with them, and by littered I mean they are everywhere. Almost like the developers got confused between jump scares and the environmental storytelling that Dead Space possessed, with the body bags or the bodies that had been piled together that made me feel like I didn't want to enter those specific rooms, like I hadn't been welcome aboard the Ishimura. However, if there is one enemy that takes the cake for me, it is the tentacle that grabs you, that ultimately makes the experience feel cheap for me, which consists of a human head attached to a tentacle that's also attached to a flesh beanbag on the floor. And all of these enemy-related jump scares deal damage. Sometimes you can enter an area walking through a door and this thing will be there to greet you like a crazy ex-lover. Another time there had been one of these little monsters next to a ladder, so once you climb up the ladder and out of the hole, you instantly get grabbed. So for the audio side of things that I haven't spoken about, the ambiences and the ambient music is great, with a lot of themes that derive from Dead Space, which is what I had expected, that excellent usage of audio to help immerse the player. However, at this point, music and sound effects had been the only thing that created tension. But let's be fair, it doesn't matter if you create the highest amount of tension and suspense, because it can be all ruined by some stupid jump scare. Which, in the making of Dead Space, the developers actually tried proactively to avoid the jump scare mechanic as much as possible, as seen in the video Making of Dead Space Behind the Scenes. Rich Briggs, that had been a producer for Dead Space, spoke about the overusage of scares in horror games, and that you can't just keep using the same scare as you'll become used to it, and the horror and scares will wash over you, effectively just not even phasing you. If a horror game isn't scary, then has it failed as a horror title? It's like telling a joke. It may be the best joke you've ever told, it might even be hilarious the first few times you say it, but after you continue to tell it over and over again in the same way, the effect wanes, and the joke just simply is not funny anymore. It's the same thing with horror. For this part, I am sad to say that the horror elements in this game had been underwhelming, becoming a jump scare fest rather than a competent horror title, which, sorry Glenn, but you know, I kind of became immune to jump scares after my work experience at Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria. I'm sorry to say this, but I'm going to have to award this game with a 2 out of 10 for this horror, because let's be fair, the horror in this game is an absolute joke. The world that the moon of Callisto inhabits is indeed a very beautiful one, to be had with landscapes and the corridors and locations being coated in amazing graphics. So while the horror and the gameplay crashes and burns, the world itself looks very pretty, with a wide variety of different areas and locations that Jacob visits and passes through in his grisly tale. The lighting, as always, is done well, however in some parts, even while playing with the brightness on a very low setting, can be a bit too bright, which makes me squint from time to time, as you normally have been travelling through complete darkness with only a few patches of light coming from fires to guide your path, and then you see a very bright room that further disorientates the player, which I think might have been intended, but for me it hurts to visit these areas. My gripes with the graphics is that some parts of the elements, such as the smoke and fire we see in certain parts of the game, actually makes them resemble fire sprites that I would have seen in the PlayStation 3 era, and in other parts you will encounter white thick smoke that looks kind of cartoony that will just remain in the air when moving through the cloud, which again is a small detail and didn't really have much effect on me, but it is a bit jarring. The fog elements that can be seen later in the game, however, actually adds to the atmosphere, creating an extra layer of detail that I really appreciated even before meeting the twin-headed behemoth for the third time. The landscape of Callisto, however, frequently reminded me of Tau Volantis from Dead Space 3, as you can see the peaks of the mountainous terrain from the promotional trailers for Dead Space 3, you know, the live action one, and lo and behold, you see them here. But at least the weather isn't just of snow and ice this time, but one of thunder and ice, which does help to change things up. Throughout the game, however, you will see that the shaders of the graphics changes depending on if the game is about to play a cutscene. However, it's not really a big thing for me, but it is worth mentioning. However, I think they have fixed this in their new update. The last thing about the graphics I have taken issue with was the fact that you can clearly see Jacob moving through the snow, but he leaves no trail behind him, and in cutscenes his hands and feet just look like they phase through the snow, at least when you play on the console version. And on top of that, when I was trying to speedrun this game, which I will be mentioning in another video of the ways that the game tries to stop you from speedrunning the game, the graphics will downgrade to something that just literally looks like the characters, and it just makes everything go down to low res, which was hilarious, but should it really be happening in this type of video game? Seriously, that literally counteracts the atmosphere of the game itself when you see that some enemies in cutscenes turn into, well, cream enemies, let's just be fair. For this point, I will give this segment a 6 out of 10, just due to the high level of detail put into the graphics, despite what happens when you try to speedrun the game. Now, as many of you know, and have seen in various reviews, the PC port had landed with a very unstable stuttering, which isn't unheard of in a game when it launches, but honestly I can't think of any other game that had this FPS issue that was to be a single player game. Now, the console I played on was the Xbox Series S, and I can tell you that the gameplay had minimal stuttering. But the cutscenes were a different story, with them rendering at 30 frames per second, which was completely jarring to the experience. I mean, you go from 60 frames per second in gameplay to 30 frames in cutscenes, which we could all tell when each frame was going by, which further disorientated me from the experience altogether. However, the camera was the thing that completely took the cake for me, and I think some of you will agree on this, that this camera has a mind of its own. For instance, in combat, the camera will tell you what it wants you to aim at, or which enemy you should be attacking, even if the enemy is behind others. It gets to the point where it becomes frustrating to argue with this camera, as it hates you. I believe I called the issue a jammed stabilizer. The cast of the Callisto protocol did a great job, even though their characters are about as flat as a chessboard due to the poor writing, so for performance I will give this segment a 3 out of 10. Points going towards the cast, but again, the performance of the camera really let me down. The stuttering of the shader compilation was terrible, yes, but fixable, as soon they had fixed the issue, or, so I've heard. The saving and checkpoint system in the game doesn't do anyone any favors either. Here you'll be strolling along and then you'll see a reforge station, maybe you'll upgrade some stuff, sell some items, maybe even loot the room, then move on to the next battle arena, or, area where you are locked in combat, and then perhaps you die, perhaps in a cheap way, as let's be fair, the biophages will just about exploit anything to kill you. Regardless, you die and then you spawn back next to the reforged station. But wait, there's a problem. You got this checkpoint as soon as you entered the room. So what does that mean? Well, my good sir, I'm afraid you have to upgrade, sell, and loot everything all over again. Sometimes you may not even find the same items, as they are based on RNG if they even show up. So if you found something good that could help you in the next fight, or in the future of your playthrough, odds are that it won't be in the room the second time or the third time round when you respawn. If you thought that the manual saving system would fix this, you would be wrong. See, when you save the game is just too lazy to put you where you saved, so when you load the save file, it will just throw you to the nearest checkpoint you last accessed. Funny story though, Glen, the end boss was complete overkill. The complete opposite from your last boss in Dead Space, where the hive mind was literally the most pathetic boss you could ever call in video games. And you'd think that the game would just CC the character and all of his abilities, but no, the game had CC'd me, the player. When I was about to beat the boss and beat the game, it booted me back to the dashboard and forced me to update the game for 30 minutes, which, I'm not gonna lie, that was the pinnacle of my experience. I was literally on the edge of my seat waiting for that update to be over so I could finish this abomination of a game. So moving back to my original question, does the Callisto Protocol meet the mark for a spiritual successor to Dead Space? Does it beat the game on all of its fronts? Unfortunately, no. The Callisto protocol is plagued by the same issues that the original Dead Space had, with the poor writing, game mechanics that had a 30% chance of failing, and the two, however, differ in terms of horror, as Dead Space did it much better and had a much more consistent rate throughout the entire game, making the experience feel like you were slowly being hunted by these necromorphs. Callisto Protocol, on the other hand, makes you feel like you're having a stroll through a haunted house attraction, attempting to jump scare the player any chance it can get. Never did the game even attempt to disturb me to my core like Dead Space did. And you probably have been wondering why I keep bringing up Dead Space. Well, that's because if you call this a spiritual successor, then the Callisto Protocol should at least meet the mark. On the graphical side of things, Callisto wins every time, as even though Dead Space holds up to this day, it doesn't hold up to the technology available for developers today. The Callisto Protocol, in my eyes, has failed to recapture what had made Dead Space so great back then, and this game had me missing the necromorphs more and more every step I had been descending into the Callisto moon, making me wish I had been back on board the Ishimura, which I won't have long to wait. The Callisto Protocol, in my opinion, is much more than the flaws of Stuttering on day one, and contains a whole plethora of issues that need straightening out before the game can even be called a completely finished game. However, maybe Glen will see this video and gain some insight into how his game is to be perceived, but I really do doubt that, because judging by his behavior on Twitter, with him stating that only the true fans will be on his side no matter what, which, let's be fair, those aren't true fans, those are just some fanboys, a bunch of yes men that game developers just surround themselves with because they cannot handle criticism these days. But his response to the backlash of the Callisto Protocol will be for a future video. The Callisto Protocol just seems to have been a rushed out product to beat EA to the punch, hoping to make the Christmas season before the Dead Space sets in the following month. So for this game, I have to give it an overall score of 5.5 out of 10. Mainly due to yet another unfinished game masquerading as a finished and polished product, which actually makes me feel more depressed, as it's not like I didn't want to enjoy this game. I mean, I spent a lot of money on it, only to be disappointed with the product I got. Maybe instead of calling themselves the Masters of Horror, Striking Distance should have been making sure that this game actually works in all aspects. It's also kind of comedic in a way, as they had been pumping out these Masters of Horror docu-series episodes telling everyone how they have mastered horror, when their game is about as far as you can get from the frickin' horror title. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, then hit the video with a like rating. Didn't agree with my rating? Well, give me yours down below and tell me why. Sign up to join the British Alliance today by subscribing and ringing in the notification bell so you are always notified for more content like this when it goes up. A special thank you to all of my channel members for the extra mile you go for this channel. I really do appreciate you. And if you would like to become a member today, then hit that join button and see which of the tiers takes your fancy. And I will see all of you among the cosmos, and be sure to have a good one.